It's good to be here, and I would like to first of all state that when I talk about democratization today, it's going to be pretty much limited to discussion of closed societies and authoritarian states. There are a lot of very good things about the internet, the way it allows people to fight on global issues like climate change or nuclear proliferation or raising money for victims of various natural disasters like we've heard this morning. That's not my primary subject of interest. My primary subject is looking at what happens in closed and authoritarian societies like China, like Iran, under the pressure of the internet. And I would like to try to show that there are two ways to think about the impact of the internet on those countries. First is to think about the internet as a new environment in which these governments and people living in those countries are actually forced to operate. The second way to think about this issue is to think of the internet as a tool that actors, and here I mostly mean foreign actors, whether it's Western governments or foundations or various do-gooders, can actually use to try to incite democratic change in those societies. So on the one hand, we have this brand new environment which may be helping the forces of democracy or which may be helping the forces of authoritarianism. And on the other hand, we have the internet as a tool that people sitting in Washington or Brussels or London, you name it, are actually trying to embrace as a means of opening up some of these countries. On the first question of the environment, I think there has been a lot of confusion and a lot of enthusiasm in terms of what the internet can actually do. You've all heard a lot of predictions how authoritarianism is going to become untenable, how people are going to get organized and mobilized via tools like Twitter and Facebook, how people are going to discover information that has been hidden from them. And I think a lot of this is true. It's just that there are other second-order effects that the internet has on the societies that we have to keep in mind when we think about democratization. And I think the major problem so far in this discourse has been that we've been drawing on a very limited picture of what makes modern authoritarian regimes tick. I mean, if you believe that the reasons why modern Russia, modern China function is because they coerce people and hide information, then of course the internet will be probably seen as the magic bullet to open up and democratize those states. If you, however, draw on a more sophisticated picture of politics in those states, which does look at forces like nationalism or culture, or center-periphery relations, or the threat of foreign attack, or you name it, you'll actually probably end up with a somewhat different answer. In part because it's very hard for political scientists, I'm not talking about geeks and technologists, it's very hard for political scientists themselves to understand what it is, what kind of role nationalism, for example, plays in bringing democracy to today's Russia or to today's China. So as long as we don't have an answer to that first order question, trying to understand how the internet influences nationalism is not going to tell us much. Right? So what I've been calling for in the last few years was actually trying to go beyond debating the impact of the internet on those states and trying to understand how those states actually function. Because the moment you start drawing a more sophisticated, fine-grained institutional picture of those regimes, you'll immediately start getting answers which are different from this mainstream answer that more information and more mobilization is going to cure authoritarianism. Again, if you look at what the internet does allow people to do, of course it is to mobilize and to organize. The problem is that many of the groups that would like to get mobilized and organized in these countries are not necessarily pro-democratic, and they don't necessarily share the kind of agenda that many, do-gooders in the West would like to promote. So to me, it's not clear whether the fact that, Chinese nationalists can now organize and mobilize online and actually push their government to take on more jingoistic and kind of, hawkish policies, whether it's actually good for, the future of democracy in China. Again, the only reason why I'm saying this is that we have to start from the real political environment which the internet is supposed to shape, and then to investigate how it affects each of those forces that shape and define that environment. We cannot just start with this binary model where the only actors are the bad guys, the authoritarian governments, and then there are the good guys, the democratic dissidents and protesters. The playing field is much more diverse, and there are many more forces that we have to analyze and keep in mind. The second point I would like to make is that despite this lack of understanding and clarity on how exactly the internet affects modern authoritarian states, there is definitely a lot of excitement. I would say that excitement probably mostly emanates from Washington in terms of embracing the power of the internet to open up these countries. I would say that it probably got manifested in the famous internet freedom speech that many of you are aware that Hillary Clinton delivered in January, which, if you look at it, is a very curious speech. On some level, all that it proposes is to defend the freedom of the internet. But if you read very closely behind the lines and between the lines, you'll actually discover that there are some hints that Washington does want to promote freedom via the internet as well. Which means that one of the reasons to keep the internet free is to ensure that there are protests like those that happened in Iran, and those that happened in China the same year, and those that happened in Moldova earlier, and those that happened in Colombia in 2008. So the implicit assumption is that a freer internet will by default lead to some kind of revolution or an uprising, or some kind of social protest, which may eventually result in democratization. And I think, it's probably not completely inaccurate to describe situation that way. The problem is that it automatically politicizes the space to an extent where authoritarian governments themselves become extremely concerned, and much more concerned than the evidence actually justifies, and they start cracking down on bloggers, and most importantly on internet companies, many of whom have been, whether they want it or not, recruited to fight in this war for internet freedom. And I think there are a lot of dangers here, because drawing a parallel between dissidents and bloggers may have some useful rhetorical gains and advantages. I don't think that every blogger I met in a place like Belarus or Russia or Central Asia that actually signed up to be dissidents. They signed up for something completely different, and many of them actually had few political aspirations. And my fear is that right now we are entering a zone where every single act that, whether the Western governments or Western companies make in this space will reflect badly on its users, because all the users now are seen as, the future equivalents of, Andrei Sakharov. And I think there are a lot of dangers, and I don't think that this move to protect and promote internet freedom has been well thought, either on the strategic or on the rhetorical level. I think even though we don't really have a good theory to explain how the internet affects democratization, we still know quite a lot about the history of foreign policy. We still know quite a lot about the biases that many entities and countries have towards America promoting all sorts of revolutions through either covert or overt means. Again, this space very easily breeds conspiracy theories, even when there are no malign intent involved. And I think we all have to be very careful, because accusations of duplicity are inevitable. We all heard Ali Cross deliver a great speech this morning, And he did point this very interesting difference between open and closed societies and how it played out throughout history. But if you look at who poses the biggest threat to the openness of the internet at this point in history, it's actually the US government, which through wiretapping requests from FBI, from surveillance requests from NSA, which through various shady agreements like ACTA, is actually pushing for more control of the internet. It's not the Chinese or the Iranian governments which are pushing Western companies to re-engineer the internet protocols. All of that is coming from Washington. And again, it doesn't mean that the State Department, or it doesn't mean that American diplomats shouldn't speak up on behalf of the freedom of expression, but they have to be careful to frame their defense in a way that wouldn't make themselves vulnerable to accusations of duplicity, which are inevitable when the rest of the US government is asking for much more control of the internet than either the Chinese or the Iranians. I think I'll stop here, and I'll be more than happy to take any questions after we're through with it. Thank you.
That's great, and that's a great place to stop. Actually, Evgeny, have a seat. Okay. Have a seat. What we're going to do is ask you to hold your questions. The idea here was to have present two very strong, provocative talks, and then invite a lot of interchange. So relax. You need some water?
Yes.
And I'm going to invite our last speaker up. Jeremy Heimans is the founder of Purpose, which is a international consultancy that works on a wide range of advocacy campaigns worldwide. He comes to this space with great experience as an organizer online. In 2005, was the founder or co-founder of Get Up Australia, which is like Australia's MoveOn.org. And then in 2007, he co-founded Avaz, which I'm sure a lot of you probably know is the world's largest e-activist organization with more than 6 million members as of now. And so he brings a tremendous depth of experience and passion as well to the idea that the internet and people using the internet to organize collectively can be a force for positive change. So I wanted to ask Jeremy to give his thoughts on this topic, and then the three of us will sit together and invite your comments and questions. Jeremy, come on up.
Well, thanks. See if I'm mic'd up.
Turn on.
Hello? Hello? Oh, well. Well, thanks so much, Mika, and...
He's not done.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks so much, Mika and Andrew, for having me here to speak. It's a pleasure to be here. And, I think one of the reasons that Mika and Andrew did ask me to speak was that, they knew that Evgeny would be pointing to some of the sort of the downers, really, about how the internet is being used, particularly in closed societies. And they probably asked me to come after Evgeny to perk things up a little bit and to offer a slightly more rosy picture. And actually, I think in many ways, Evgeny and I are not really in direct conflict here, because he's really speaking about closed societies, and what I want to focus on here is the way in which the internet is transforming open societies and sort of partially open societies, societies in which online organizing is possible. So what I want to do is engage a debate which is happening right now that's critiquing... I do love to walk around, but I guess...
Let's see if we can fix it.
That's critiquing... we'll try.
Is that working?
Yeah, that's great. Fantastic. I want to engage this debate that's sort of critiquing the role of online organizing. There have been a couple of interesting pieces over the last couple of weeks. Some of you may have read them. And these are a couple of quotes. One is an article in The Guardian that appeared, which said, "The obsession with tracking clicks turns digital activism into clicktivism." The end result is the degradation of activism into a series of petition drives that capitalize on current events. Political engagement becomes a matter of a few links. So Michael White here is arguing that essentially online organizing lends toward trivial, shallow engagement. And this article just last week in The New Yorker by Malcolm Gladwell. The evangelists of social media believe that a Facebook friend is the same as a real friend. And he talks about this concept of weak ties. He says, online organizing cultivates weak ties, ties between people who don't know each other very well, who are not closely linked or organized. Whereas the kind of activism, he says, that generates real social change is based on strong ties, small, tightly knit groups of people who know each other very well. Well, I want to put a different perspective on that, and in order to do that, I want to talk about my own experience of starting one of the organizations that Mika referred to, GetUp, and to talk about how an organization like GetUp, a mature, robust attempt at using online organizing as part of a broader toolkit to produce social change, can actually very effectively fuse the weak and the strong ties. So let me tell you about GetUp. This is the man that we were confronted with in Australia in 2005 when we started GetUp. His name was John Howard. He was a great friend of the Bush administration and a very conservative guy, so not the political worldview that we shared or that many of the people in Australia who were opposed to the Howard government shared. So our challenge was essentially how to disintermediate the formal political process in order to do something more interesting. There were a number of major social problems in Australia that progressives were outraged about. For example, Australia had a policy of locking up people who came to Australia as asylum seekers in refugee detention and holding them, essentially and their children, in kind of desert prisons while their refugees were being processed. So this was the sort of thing that many people who would call themselves progressive in Australia were outraged about. But John Howard had already been in power for about 9 years. People felt like there was nothing they could do. So our challenge was, how do we create a political movement where the formal political process had failed that would engage and reawaken Australians? So we decided to create something called GetUp. And really when we started GetUp, it wasn't really a movement. That's why I put movement in inverted commas. But we knew that if we could create something that inspired Australians and got them back involved in the political process, we had some shot of shaking up the country. So we made a television ad to launch the organisation, and at that stage we didn't really have any members. So the only people we could rustle up here were my sister and my niece. And that was the movement. And so we launched this organisation, and the first thing we asked people to do was to just ask people to write to their members of parliament by email. There's a new Senate that had just been elected, and tell the Senate that they would be holding them to account because the political opposition, through the political parties, was failing to do that. You know, clearly not a very radical thought. And in Australia in 2005, this was shocking. And the government, having received the first onslaught of a coordinated, targeted email campaign, had a little bit of a freak out. And a key government minister got on television and said, members of parliament are beside themselves. They have received so many emails from their own constituents. This is nothing more than spam. And I might add, these were emails that were individually crafted. There was no template or form email in this case. We asked people just to write their own messages to their own elected officials in their own constituencies. And of course, he came up and he declared this spam. This was great for the movement, great for GetUp. Because as you can imagine, many Australians felt that it was pretty outrageous that the political class was asking and complaining about letters to their own constituents. So where are we now? Well, GetUp is now the largest political organisation in Australia, and using these online organising techniques, we've built up a membership that exceeds the membership of all of the political parties put together. And, you know, you might ask the question, well, what has this achieved? And are these people really connected, or are they just clicking? Well, let's start by the question of how these people are experiencing their identity. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I was reading a newspaper article about GetUp. I now live in the US, and I observe from a distance. And I was reading about a new campaign that GetUp was launching in which they were targeting the banks and actually launching a class action against Australia's banks for predatory fees, which was a lot of fun. Anyway, I always look at the comments from users, of course, to get a gauge for how people are reacting to these campaigns. And this was one of these moments in organising that you dream of, which is that one day the organisation you create where you're trying to build real community, really robust engagement, might actually go beyond your own sister and start to engage other people's sisters. And so I went through these comments, and this person had started the comment thread with a sort of attack on GetUp as being a left-wing front for the existing political parties. And then I was greeted by this stream of comments. So the person responded, "I am GetUp. Like Meg, I am GetUp, and my partner, sister, mother, father, and many of my friends. Guess what? Like Meg, I'm GetUp too. I too am GetUp, so is my wife and daughter. None of us belong to any political party, union, or Tea Party for that matter." And this person I enjoyed. This is the kind of comment you'd only find in Australia. It's a community-based group. Most of the members are actually older. Hell, I'm bloody ancient. And I joined, and I'm not a political party member. And it was sort of seeing this, it was this amazing glimpse into the fact that for people, GetUp was becoming a source of identity. It was becoming a badge that even though none of these people knew each other, they all identified with this identity, this organisation, I am GetUp. They were calling themselves GetUp. And I want to drill down on some of the comments in that thread because I found them really illuminating about how people were engaging with the organisation. GetUp is an organisation that constantly refers back to its membership for direction on what we, the membership, would like them to do. So there's this sense of being part of a group, having some accountability, that the organisation was accountable to the members, and actually feeling like the members were being listened to. As far as its funding is concerned, I donate $20 here and there. It's not a charity, so there's no drain on taxpayers. I give the money because it is an organisation which gives its members a say on the types of issues that we as a democracy see are important. So again, we're seeing this role of fundraising, this role of giving money, as a critical part of the process of people becoming invested in the movement and becoming invested in action. So you see this process of these disconnected people with very weak ties, as Gladwell might have it, forming identity, becoming politicised. Many of these people were probably not involved in the formal political process before GetUp. And you know, equally, people seeing GetUp here as a way to fight the established political process, the corruption and power broking in politics. I am GetUp too. I want them to succeed where others have failed and restore confidence in our democratic processes. And this is GetUp today. And interestingly, you'll see this picture, there's not a lot of clicking going on in this picture because by building a robust movement online, we started this just by scaling, by engaging people with very simple, low barrier to entry online actions. But if you do this seriously and robustly, if you don't just do this as a flash in the pan, as a one-off campaign that spontaneously responds to an event, but if you try to consolidate the power that you create into a real movement, you end up with this: real people knocking on doors, making phone calls, getting out on the street and dressing up their dogs in t-shirts of GetUp. And this iconic colour and brand that became GetUp, this orange that you see all over the country at election time. So I want to give you an example of a campaign that GetUp recently ran to kind of drill down into some of the techniques that I used to take something that might just feel good or be about clicking and turn it into real, meaningful political impact. So the Howard government, the man that I showed you up earlier, being very conservative, didn't really like young voters because young voters tend to vote more progressive. So he instituted a bunch of laws that basically were designed to mean that if you were a young person who hadn't yet registered to vote because you just turned 18, you had just 24 hours. Anyone who wasn't on the electoral rolls had 24 hours after an election was called to get on the rolls, which is very onerous because most people, you know, the election is called at unexpected moment and then, you know, people had to scramble 24 hours to get on the rolls. And the effect of this was to suppress turnout by young people. So GetUp decided to challenge this in court. But before we did, and this was just a few months ago, before we did, we decided
to ask our members about it. So I want to run you through the arc of this campaign because I think it's instructive. There were sort of 3 steps to the campaign, and in doing so we were bringing people along, building this kind of ownership, this sense of shared purpose that I'm referring to. So the first thing that GetUp did was they emailed the members and they said, okay, we have to actually get your advice on whether to do this. And I remember receiving the email before the email to the members went out from the executive director saying, you know, I don't know whether we should do this. It's very distracting. We're in the middle of an election campaign. We're doing a lot of campaigning on climate change and other issues. And I said, well, why don't we ask the members? So the email said, the lawyers are preparing the case, the documents are ready to file, but the legal system is a new arena for GetUp, and this court case has the potential to cost more than a normal GetUp campaign. So this is the email to the members. So I need to know whether this is enough of a priority for you. I urgently need to know whether you support this campaign. What's your vote? So we ask the members to vote. We don't always ask the members to vote. This is not a Greek democracy, and part of what makes organisations like this effective is that they can respond quickly without sort of polling the membership on every issue, and they can be somewhat directive about the issues that we campaign on. But in this case, it was an important issue, so we took it to a vote. 86% said, do it. Step 2, we emailed the membership 2 days later and we said, okay, we've made this decision together. 86% of us have said, let's do this, to go to court. So why don't you give us some money to help make it happen? An important part of the endowment effect associated with these organisations is that once you've contributed, you feel much more part of the outcome. So we wanted people to contribute to this court case and ensure that it was well funded and a success. And then, of course, we won the court case. We took it to the High Court, the highest court in the land, and in the fastest ever decision by a High Court, the High Court ruled these laws of the previous government unconstitutional and ordered the Australian Electoral Commission to enrol 100,000 voters in time for the election. That was in just a few weeks' time. 100,000 voters that later turned out to be critical in the outcome of the election. And this was the email from the GetUp member, one of the emails sent over. Because of GetUp, I just received an email from the Electoral Commission saying that I can now vote. Oh, the relief and excitement. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I hope my overcapitalisation adequately expresses the gratitude I feel. So, you know, it's these shared victories and also the shared defeats that create the identity, the passion that can create real political power and real impact. And in this case, 100,000 real people who were enrolled to vote and to help shift the outcome of what was an extremely close election. So these are some of the headlines when we won. So what I want to do now is talk to you a little bit more theoretically about what online organising is good at and what some of the limitations are so that we can understand how to actually pull this together in a really effective way. So there are 6 things that I think online organising of the kind that I describe is very good at. The first most obvious thing is money. It was interesting that in Malcolm Gladwell's piece, he implied that I think a particular Facebook group had many members but had raised no money, and he used this as an example of how people weren't really committed or prepared to sacrifice. Well, that really couldn't be more true couldn't be less true, I might say, of effective online organising. Effective online organising is incredibly effective at mobilising small donations to match the power of large interests. Through GetUp, we didn't need, you know, tens of millions of dollars of large corporations, donations, etc., to actually match the power of those large interests with small donations. Secondly, online organising is very good at generating and producing scale. These low barrier to entry actions are just part of a process of moving people up a curve of engagement, but the scale itself is incredibly useful at those critical moments. Thirdly, online organising delivers speed. It allows you very quickly to respond to a moment of urgency or crisis because you have the capacity to do so that you couldn't do pre-internet, but that was also very difficult for a larger lumbering organisation to do. Fourthly, at critical moments when you're running a campaign that might involve paid media, that might involve lobbying, that involves all of those traditional tools of advocacy, online organising delivers legitimacy. Because instead of just saying, we, a small group of people, believe this, you get the legitimacy of a much larger number, which is critical in many of these campaigns where you're trying to establish a real political constituency for an issue. Fifthly, and I think this is a critical piece, An effective online movement is about building infrastructure. It's not about a one-off campaign, and so I would agree with those critics who would say, well, a tweet in and of itself or a spontaneously organized campaign on Twitter isn't enough. It's an important step to resolve a particular crisis, but the real challenge is how do you keep people engaged after the big moment of mobilization? Who's there the next day to keep those people politicized? And that's what these organizations like Avaz and GetUp are very good at doing. And finally, well-organized online movements are very good at getting people to go from online to offline. Which really brings me to my next point, which is that the weak ties that Gladwell describes are indeed not enough. A whole bunch of people who don't know each other very well and who are uncoordinated can't get a lot of stuff done, although they can have important cultural impacts. But when you combine the weak ties that mean that all these people who are part of GetUp feel deeply connected to each other with some strong ties, and those are the kinds of ties that emerge in offline organizing where people are meeting, they're knocking on doors together, they're forming local groups, they're building deep bonds, you begin to get something very, very powerful. Secondly, weak ties and the kind of decentralized organization that you need also need to be combined with real strategy. So the organizations like GetUp, like these effective online movements, are actually highly strategic. And they're not run by the Life of Brian collective of, I don't know if you remember that scene from the Life of Brian where they all sit around together having internal debates about how the left should be structured. They're actually not like that at all. They're very tightly knit and they're quite centralized. They're quite controlled. They give real direction to the members, which is a point that Evgeny made about effective organizing in a recent piece that he wrote. And fourthly, they're well designed organizationally. And this is one of the most interesting and curious things. You would think that these weak tie movements are more factional, but they're actually less factional. A well-designed organization has less factions in it. And I'm just going to very quickly run through a couple of these slides. I've only got 2 minutes left. So the other thing that online organizing has been very effective at is transnational organizing. So one thing that the traditional offline organizing, which was very good at that local engagement, can't do is coordinate people transnationally to address major global problems. And there's really an asymmetry that organizations like Avaz are trying to address between governments and multinational corporations that are very well organized transnationally and people who are not. Which is why when we're addressing huge problems like climate change, we need transnational movement making because that's where the scale of the problem is. I also want to leave you with an interesting thought, which was that one of the insights of the work that I've done over the last bunch of years is that we found that pure political organizing hasn't been enough, and that what we really need to do is tap other sources of power beyond the pure mode of appealing to decision makers to change laws and policies. So one of the things that we're doing at Purpose is trying to figure out how do you mobilize consumers? What does a 21st century consumer boycott look like to mobilize collective power against corporations and really shift demand out of the bad products and services into the good ones? How do you mobilize shareholders using the same technology tools to actually balance the power of large interests? And how finally do you mobilize audiences? So I leave you with this simple thought. These organizations are very young. They're only just getting started. Give us a few years, and I promise you we'll have done even more. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one question to get us started, and then we have 15 minutes or so, roughly, and then we'll go to the cocktails. But Evgeny, I want to come back to you and see if I can weave Jeremy in. You make, I think, a very good point about the danger of Western governments sort of entangling themselves into what this bottom-up flowering of interest in activism, whether it's in the organized forms that Jeremy is describing or in the completely disorganized worlds of hashtags, okay? Let's stipulate and push that point to the side. Let's take the Iran case. Do you think that there was no positive value of in terms of the pressure it may have put on the regime for people to have their attention focused in a way that perhaps the mainstream media might not have done on its own? I mean, the clearest example I can give is CNN fail. Okay, so the weekend of the election suppression that began in Iran, CNN was off covering some celebrity nonsense, and people started tweeting that CNN was failing. And it pushed and shamed the network into doing more coverage. So would you concede that the Twitter's role as a attention focuser can be helpful, apart from the interfering role of the government, or are these two things too entangled and exaggerated for you?
Sure. No, there is definitely a positive role that, bringing the world's attention to what was happening in Iran, it definitely played an important role. The question, I think, is, could you think of any other examples where bringing attention to similar issues would actually hurt the chances of democratization or hurt the chances of, thoughtful Western policy? And, the example I usually give when, asked this question is, the photos that came out of Mogadishu in Somalia in the early 90s, where you had dead American soldiers basically, drawn through the streets of Mogadishu, which then forced the U.S. to withdraw from, its troops. Again, there are plenty of ways in which you can mobilize new media to exert a lot of pressure on decision makers. Not all of that pressure would always be healthy from, policy planning perspective. If you are an American diplomat, you do not want to be probably influenced by the highly emotional photos and pictures and tweets. And it's important and people are talking about it. But, we still have representative democracy where we do leave some autonomy for people to, empowered to make decisions. I know it may sound offensive in this audience, but, it's not a direct democracy yet, nor do I think it's going to be healthy if we move to one. So as long as these new pressure points, do not usurp and impinge on autonomy of decision makers. Not all of them are evil, by the way, so I would rather have people who are experts in Iranian policy draft Iranian policy in accordance with, their own knowledge of the region, as opposed to thousands of tweets which create this, new pressure environment.
But you can't put that genie back in the bottle.
Of course you can. I mean, you can just disregard the tweets.
Well, yeah, but I mean, as earlier today in the conversation that Nicholas van der Meij started us, we have a media system that is very reactive. It's not new.
Sure.
It follows blood and explosions, and we react emotionally. And whether that's transmitted on television or via new media, it's the same thing.
Sure,
We've
but the question is not about the media architecture or the media system. The question is about policy architecture and the policy system, right? I mean, you can probably design, policy planning process which will not be, which will not succumb to pressure that is coming.
So you refer to a policy planning process that is less responsive to public opinion. Am I hearing you correctly?
Not necessarily. What is public opinion? A bunch of Facebook groups is not public opinion. Public opinion is when you show up to vote. I can go and create, I can be, BP and go create 25 Facebook groups that will tell you that, nothing is happening in the Gulf of Mexico and it's all positive for the environment. Would you respond to the pressure from those Facebook groups? To me, the question is how representative digital public opinion is.
Fair question,
of the public opinion as
I
a
want
whole.
Jeremy to jump in on that, and then we'll bring in the audience. But Evgeny is in effect saying that what you do can be so easily gamed or faked that politicians shouldn't really listen.
I mean, I actually
because
don't.
we could.
Because Al-Qaeda has more or less the same model. Sorry to draw that comparison. It's a transnational movement which does have a lot of supporters, which they mobilize online to exert pressure on governments and and decision makers.
Okay.
I'm not sure that it can be as easily gamed or faked. I mean, the reality is there has to be an authentic basis for this. And I think that what you see is unless there's some coordination to the decentralized activity, it doesn't really stick. So, you know, pure decentralized tweeting can be effective, you know, in a short-term burst of activity. Real robust movement making has to combine the decentralization with a real strategy.
Sure.
And when those things are combined, I think it's very powerful and it's impossible to fake. Because the reality is that you actually need smart thinking, direction, focus that goes beyond, you know, the immediate response for these things to build real power. So I'm not sure those things are actually incompatible. You know, and I agree that I think we need to be thoughtful about when and how we intervene. So organizations like ours, any organization involved in transnational movement building where you're trying to apply pressure from one part of the world to another part of the world, need to make political judgments about when that pressure is effectively applied and when it's more likely to lead to backlash. And so I think we need to be judicious about how we do it, but I think that you know, when it's done well, it can be enormously impactful, and it reminds people that the effect of these issues is often transnational.
Great. Okay, let's go to the audience. I see a hand up back there. You're first. Wait for the mic, please.
Okay. So, all this was very interesting, but it seems that we are still stuck in the idea of quantity and not of quality. I mean, yes, you can have 100 people behind you, you can have 100,000 people, you can have 1,000,000 people, but you're not actually being able to integrate the mind of those people into one unit so that they all can integrate what they know and what they think into doing something.
Well, I guess that's addressed to me. I mean, I think that if all an organization does is aggregate, if all they do is produce scale, then I agree with you. But again, the more mature organizations that are doing this work are absolutely integrative. I mean, that's precisely what they're doing. So they're connecting a broad idea, you know, or a set of values with real opportunities to take action, and then they're seeking highly specific political victories of the kind that I described in my talk, where, you know, a broad movement, you wouldn't have been able to generate that court case without the scale that GetUp provided. It provided the idea, the support, the money, etc., the legitimacy. But we were then able to convert that to a very real political victory, and I could cite many others. So in fact, the challenge is how you use the scale that you generate to enable the more deeply committed people to self-select into leadership roles and into roles in which they can play more impactful roles. But that scale that supports that is actually immensely important.
So
okay, another question. Let's have another.
It's still the older structure.
No, we don't have time to have a debate, I'm afraid, so I really want to let other people ask questions if we have. Or I will come back to you if no one else has a question. Go. Here. There's a gentleman up front here.
Hi, I'm Ben from the Netherlands. I have a question for you, Evgeny. I think that's the way you pronounce your name.
Speak right into the mic, please.
I've been trying to figure out why the US is trying to monitor the internet or, you know, restrict internet freedom in such a way. You seem to have studied quite well, so in your words or in your view, what do you think the reason is internet freedom is being restricted by the US?
Which government?
The US he's talking
US government.
The US. Well, it's, again, I think we are setting up a lot of rhetorical traps for ourselves when we operate in terms like internet freedom. The problem is, you know, the analogy, which may backfire here, I don't know, but which I usually use is that, you know, if you take a machine gun and if you mount a megaphone on top of that machine gun, there would still be plenty of reasons to regulate, you know, and have gun control, even though it allows you to, you know, express yourself and practice freedom of expression. You know, the thing is that the internet, as good as it is as a vehicle for freedom of expression, is being used by, you know, child pornographers or terrorists or, you know, all sorts of evil and less evil non-state actors. So any government, and the US government is no exception, will be concerned about the ways in which the internet can be abused for, you know, terrorism, crime, cyber warfare, you name it. And if the last 2 decades are anything to judge by, those concerns actually accumulated. right? And you may argue that all of those are myths, and there is no cybercrime, and there is no cyber warfare, and it's a position I myself have taken on many occasions. But I mean, there are a lot of reasonable people who are concerned with national security, who are, pretty much holding the same positions that the governments of Saudi Arabia or the United Emirates. They do want to control what passes through their networks. We can debate whether governments in the modern era still need to retain that capacity, but I pretty much know how that debate will end, unfortunately. So to me, when one part of the US government comes up with a highly ambitious, and in my opinion, utopian plan to promote internet freedom, when 99% of the US government wants to promote internet control, I think it will only reveal the duplicity of the US government. So to me, the question is not really why the US government is doing this. It's pretty clear, what their motivation is. It's why they are deliberately setting up a trap for themselves. That's the key question.
Well, Evgeny, 99%. I mean, I appreciate, I think,
yes,
you're issuing a very clear call to arms, if you
yes,
will. But I don't think that this question is settled.
It's definitely not settled, but I don't see...
There may
Sure.
be people within the U.S. government who would like to re-engineer the internet so that they can do all the things that were
Sure.
reported, which would be terrible. But it is not yet clear to me that the ISPs are at all going to go along with it.
Yeah, but the
phone
ISPs
companies,
are not part of the U.S. government
I
yet.
have more concerns about the phone companies in some ways, given what they did with wiretapping. But whether we were quite into the black hole you're describing is still an open question. Let's have a go. This gentleman here,
Jeremy, you seem very relaxed about the convening power that you have. Other people also have convening power. I think politics isn't just a battle between elected politicians and public opinion. It's also a battle between media owners, between bureaucratic interests, between corporations. And we had a writing campaign in the UK against road pricing. Essentially, a long deliberative process was completely deep-sixed by one media owner. They could get 1.7 million people signed a petition, and all of a sudden, a policy was completely destroyed. A policy that had been generated by elected politicians had been completely destroyed. I would suggest it'd be an awful lot easier to convene an anti-immigration writing campaign than it would be to convene the kind of liberal campaigns that you've been promoting. I put it to you that you're way too relaxed about the downsides of direct democracy and about the challenging representative democracy.
I mean, it's a great question. I don't think the model for this kind of organizing is to promote direct democracy. So, to your point, I don't think we should create perfect online systems in which people can organize according to the intensity of their participation, vote, and directly impact policy. I don't think that's the right direction to go. But the fact that people that we might disagree with can use the same tools to organize, isn't really, I don't think, an argument against the tools themselves.
Okay. I'm going to try and get one more question in. Yeah, back there.
Hi, Erdem from Denmark. Actually, connecting these two comments about GetUp's mission and how you do it, what's the current way of structuring your new campaign or deciding what you're going to do your campaign on? And how about using some of these deliberative platforms to let your community decide what they want to campaign on, which I think will be a step towards something like direct democracy. Have you considered this, and don't you think that would add to the legitimacy of your causes?
Well, as I mentioned, at key moments, GetUp polls its membership on strategic questions, and it does a lot of work to understand what issues its members cares about. It polls its members on a regular basis. We get constant data and feedback from our members on what they'll want to do, and it's interesting because the ultimate data you get is the number of people who participate in an action. That said, I think that what makes an organization like a GetUp or an Avaaz effective is that it isn't a pure direct democracy. that it's not purely decentralized, that there's a level of focus, that people are funneled to take action, and that's driven by a clearly articulated political strategy that's informed by all of that member feedback and data. And so I think it's quite a different model. I think that deliberative models are incredibly effective at other kinds of interventions. But for the idea of structuring a political movement with a clear view of the world, where you're not agnostic about your political views, but you're actually quite clear on what your view of the world is, then at those moments you need to funnel. I think where deliberation is very effective is at changing opinions and helping people with different views come together, deliberate, and then produce kind of cultural and political change, which I think is enormously valuable, but it just requires a different organizational and technological form.
Okay. Is there one more question from the audience?
There is one.
Yes. Woman back there, please.
Hi, I'm Bridget, I'm from the UK, and I work with political parties in the UK as well. And my question was actually prefaced by the gentleman's comments before about the differences between a successful pressure group and a political party. And my question is very simple, and direct to you, Jeremy, why don't you just stand for election?
I think the power of these organisations is precisely because they are not formal actors in the political process, and they are not constrained by formal authority, but they are able to intervene in the process and convene the established political actors without being seen as one of them. As we say in Australia, we have an expression, we help to keep the bastards honest. And that's a really important function that we simply couldn't do if we stood our own candidates.
Great. I'm going to ask Jeremy one last question, which is meant to tie back to a different point that Evgeny was making. What about the closed societies? The model you're describing, which has been successful, is in Australia, it's in the US, Avaz, primarily Europe, though a bit also in other parts of the world. What are the prerequisites for that style of e-organizing being able to work in a place like China, a place like Iran? Is there any chance you see, or are we talking about something that is pretty limited to societies that are already fairly open?
Well, I think the benefits have to outweigh the costs and the risks, so that's always the calculus that you make. I think that in those countries it's more a question of information dissemination. So where you can get information out that helps to people to organise below the radar, and where technology enables that and isn't simply used as a tool to chuck people into jail, which is an acknowledged risk, then I think there's real value added. I don't think you could run an Avaz or a Get Up style campaign in North Korea and find it effective. None of the cultural conditions are there. You might use those tools quite effectively to organise beneath the view of the government if you're appropriately controlling for if you've got a proxy cloud or some way of getting around official government firewalls.
Can I jump
in
here?
Give Evgeny the last word, sure.
I think one of the reasons why models like yours work in Western democracies is because they leverage and exploit the last modicum of decency that is actually left in Western democratic political systems, where people do still like to maintain, politicians like to maintain some image of responsible, accountable, and decent men. So you can actually pressure them with media, with blogs. It's just not going to work, I'm afraid, in places where there is very little decency left, and there was never any decency to begin with in their political structures. So no one feels accountable, and no one will feel any pressure, no matter how many emails you send. I mean, the more emails you send, the more inclined they would be to just shut down the inbox, right? So my overall concern was pushing, young people in particular towards digital activism in places like, Belarus or Russia or, Kazakhstan has been that if political change is going to happen there, it will probably happen through very old school types of politics where people do need to show up and get beaten up by the police and get arrested and serve jail terms. I mean, it sounds horrible and it sounds very unpleasant, but I feel that this is the kind of action you need to engage in to push the government, forward. And the problem is that my fear is that, the digital spaces will just create an illusion that another kind of virtual politics is actually possible, where you can enact change in places like Belarus or Russia simply by joining Facebook groups and, and signing petitions and whatnot. And I think that was at the heart of that Gladwellian critique. It was not so much how centralized movements can leverage new media, it was whether we have overestimated the power of lone wolves, so to say, to challenge big authoritarian,
I just want to add one sort of point of qualification. I think in semi-open societies, where, for example, there's high levels of corruption in the political class, but there's a democratic or semi-democratic political process, these kinds of campaigns can be very effective. In Brazil, Abaz just helped pass a big anti-corruption law. So I think in a category, a strata of countries where there's very high levels of political corruption, but there's a desire to seem politically open and there's a semi-open political process, I think this can be effective.
Well, it remains to be seen, and we are going to continue to explore this at future conferences, including at PdF Latam.